All right, B-Sides, Knoxville, great to be here. Thank you so much for having me. My talk today is Lies, Telephony, and Hacking History. Feel free to grab a copy of the slide deck. If you go to slides.dfirmat.com, that will take you to my GitHub repo. You can get a PDF of the slide deck. Let's get started. So, quick about me. I work for a big, well-known organization. Guarantee everybody here's heard of it. They just don't like me using their name. I do digital forensics and incident response. They call me vice president, whatever that means. I've got a podcast. It's been in the dustbin forever, but one of these days, we'll get back to it. If you're not connected with me on LinkedIn, do send me a connection request. Be happy to connect with you. Also on X, or the social media platform, formerly known as Twitter, at C3RKAH. Give me a follow. I'll be happy to give you a follow back. I'm an official Hacking is Not a Crime advocate. Just to set the record straight, the pejorative use of the term hacker should not be a negative thing. It's not to say cybercrime isn't crime, because it is, but know the difference. And then Warren County Career Center is local to me, where I live in Ohio. I am on the advisory board for the IT and cybersecurity program there. Also, I am a technical mentor for WAMSA, which is the Women's Security Alliance. Always looking for mentors, mentees. If that speaks to you, consider joining. Quick disclaimer, I do have a day job, but the opinions expressed, this is all me. This has nothing to do with my employer. The origins of social engineering. So some believe social engineering dates all the way back to the Garden of Eden. But regardless of what you believe, deception and trickery have likely been with us for a very long time. So we're going to talk about social engineering and technology and where those things really intertwine together. We're going to talk a lot about phone phreaking. Why phone phreaking? Well, because the telephone system became the world's first global connectable network. Before DARPA, before internet, before World Wide Web, all this stuff, we had the telephone system. And it was built by telephone companies, or telcos for short. Phone phreaking, as promised, we'll get to it. I got a lot of cool stuff to show you. So some notes about telecom history. Depending where you lived, your telco stack, your local switch, all that stuff varied greatly. I can tell you, as somebody whose father worked as an accountant for the phone company, if something didn't need to be replaced or the ongoing operating maintenance costs were lower than the cost of replacing the equipment, stuff didn't get replaced. So some of the timelines may be a little bit fluid from area to area. 19th century and onward, it really started, you had phone switch operators, and these were people who sat in chairs and they literally unplugged cables and plugged them in to other spots on a switch port, these jacks. And people didn't have direct dial, they had party lines in the early days, and what that meant was, in your neighborhood, they might tell you, you pick up on the 5th ring, your neighbor down the street picks up on the 4th ring, so on and so forth. But there's nothing to keep people from picking up and listening in and eavesdropping on calls, so there was really no expectation of privacy. As we started getting to late 19th century and early 20th century, electromechanical switches came around. So these Scheurer step-by-step, or SXS switches, started growing in footprint in the early 20th century. This was the burgeoning of automation in the telecommunications industry. Now, the importance of automation is that's what enabled phone phreaking to happen, which we're going to get to. The 1940s to the 1950s, AT&T developed automation using audible tones for long-distance call routing. So multi-frequency signals were assigned to telephone numbers. Single-frequency tones were used for line status signaling, the phone switches, if you will. These advancements paved the way for phone phreaking blue boxes in the future, and we're going to talk about that here in a moment. Getting into the 1950s and 1960s, the mid-20th century, telephone companies began more widely deploying advanced circuit switching technologies like panel and crossbar. And these switches, along with reliable transistors, made DTMF, dual tone multi-frequency support, possible. And so these things get called today mostly touch tones. And so the phones that could support these were touch tone phones. And I brought some fun relics to show in telecom for you here today. I'm not going to point fingers, but I'm going to fathom a guess that some people in the audience may or may not have ever used one of these, which is a rotary dial telephone. Now, the way this worked was you have a phone, you've got the the handset, you've got the switch hook here that would hang up, you've got a dial pad, which is numbered, you've got the dial, which rotates, and you got a metal stop. So if I wanted to dial a 555 prefix on this, I put my finger in the number 5 hole, and I spin it to the metal stop, and I let it go. To dial the next 5, I put my finger back in the number 5 hole, spin it back to the metal stop, let it go. Now, on the handset, you actually hear the pops and the clicks happening as the dial is happening. A little hack is people could actually just kind of tap the switch hook and emulate that. And again, to dial the last 5, put my finger back in 5 hole, spin it, let it go. It took time. It was actually effort to make phone calls back in the day. Also of note on this phone is everything was essentially hardwired into the phone. People didn't actually own their telephone equipment. This was really leased equipment from the phone company back in the day. Now, later on, we came out with these DTMF phones. And this looks a little more like a modern telephone, and you've got your dial pad with the numbers. We recognize this pattern today, certainly. And otherwise, the phone is very similar. What's interesting, though, is this has modular jacks for the cabling. So, back in the day, if you sucked up the cord in your vacuum sweeper, it would tear it up. Well, that was a service call to the phone company. It would actually send a technician out to the house to replace that. Eventually, they realized this is kind of silly and time-consuming and costly. Let's just make these modular jacks on the ends of these cables so people can swap it out themselves and we can just mail it to them, for example. Now, the other thing is this phone, you may have had one of these phones, but your phone system did not support it. There was a switch here. So there is a touch tone mode, which is the native, and then you had a pulse mode, which would emulate this rotary dial telephone if your phone switch did not support that. 1970s, the present, electromechanical switches were slowly being phased out in favor of newer digital switches. So electronic switching systems, or ESS for short, the migration to digital switching was the beginning of phasing out of old analog technology in favor of digital telephony. Now, when we come to modern times, voice over IP is pretty much the standard deployment just about everywhere because it's fairly inexpensive, it scales very well, a lot of advantages to voice over IP. There were still some advantages to the old landlines. For example, if your power went out, you might still have a dial tone where you could dial on the phone, that sort of thing. But it's really been kind of disappearing from the landscape as we've gone on. I've got a fun other relic here. Some of you have maybe only ever seen these in a movie. If you've seen movies that have these in them, if you haven't seen the movie War Games, check it out because this is very heavily featured. This is an acoustic coupler. So before there were internal modems, there were external modems. And before there were external modems, you had these. And the way this worked was I would pick up the handset and I would put it into the cradle here. This would have either a serial or parallel port going to the computer. It would have power. And so essentially I would dial using the phone, put the handset down the cradle, it would complete the handshake. And the way this worked is that computers would generate audible tones, analog tones if you will, from digital signals. And then on the back end it would sort of reverse that process. And basically the receiver, the earpiece if you will, the handset, would receive the data, the mouthpiece would be used to transmit the data. This particular model is very smoking. This is a 1200 baud acoustic coupler. Most of these were like around 100 baud or bits per second if you prefer, 150 or 300. Yeah, this 1200 baud model, absolutely smoking. But yeah, you may have seen these in movies, very prominently featured in war games. It's sort of interesting because you couldn't actually war dial with this, which is dialing numbers incrementally to find other computers listening using this device because it had no way to control the phone system. That was still on the phone itself, so it really wasn't until external modems came around that you could actually control the dialing and that sort of thing and hanging up and so forth. And there were some cool utilities for war dialing that came out, and it's called war dialing because, frankly, of the movie War Games. So phone phreakers, who were or are the phone phreaks? They were people who enjoy exploring phone systems. Those who enjoy experimenting with technology. Some were obsessed with learning the science and technology behind telephones and the phone networks. And if you're thinking, that sounds an awful lot like a hacker, you'd be exactly right. So a lot of people would start off phone phreaking, and then they would move into computer hacking as an extension of that hobby. Some people wanted to do computer hacking, but you were afraid of, sort of getting caught and running up big phone bills, that sort of thing. So you would, venture into phone phreaking as an extension of that. So objectives of phone phreaking. So some phone phreak motivations include learning, just an absolute thirst for knowledge, just gotta know. Meeting and talking with other phone phreaks. We're talking a very small community, oftentimes not neighbors, so they would have to dial into these bridges to chat with other phone phreaks. Pranks and mischief. I cannot understate this enough. This was a huge motivator because you probably maybe enjoyed messing with people you didn't like. You almost like messing with your friends even more. Making free phone calls to anyone, anywhere. I have to explain this for modern times because it makes no sense. I have a smartphone. It's got unlimited calling. I could call anybody in this room, talk as much or as little as I want, and it's no big deal. And so that wasn't always the case. It wasn't just flat rate commodity service. Phone companies used to charge upwards of $1 a minute for long distance phone calls. Now I have to say this, that if you were, say, a kid or a teenager and you ran up a $400 phone bill on 20th century money, and your parents saw that phone bill, you were going to be in bigger trouble than that time my boss yelled at me and grounded me for an entire month when I tried to file a business expense report for this outfit. This is not an all-inclusive list, phone phreaking and film, just some highlight ones. 3 Days of the Condor. For those who don't know, Kevin Mitnick's old hacker handle was Condor. Comes straight from this movie. There's a scene where Robert Redford socially engineers the phone company, convincing him he's another employee. The movie War Games, I mentioned earlier, my own personal favorite from this list, just because I'm a little nostalgic and I love that stuff. Obviously the movie Hackers, I think most people are familiar with that, and they got a good scene. We'll talk about how that stuff kind of worked a little bit later. Pirates of Silicon Valley was a made-for-TV movie, and the reason I highlight it here is Steve Wozniak really partnered with Steve Jobs back in the day building blue boxes. Then we'll get to blue boxes, allowing people to make free phone calls. But what's important here is that became the seed money by which Apple Computer was built, which then, of course, become Apple. Classic phone phreak tools. We're going to talk about this, musical instruments and whistles. There were a ton of different color phreaker boxes. There were some that were multi-function that would be called rainbow boxes. I'm going to highlight 3 specific here today, specifically blue boxes, beige boxes, and red boxes. There were a lot more. We'll talk about pay phones a bit, tape recorders, and then scanners and radios, which is a great dovetail from the previous talk. So phone switching and tones. Early phone systems used audible control tones. Some musical instrument notes could pass as recognizable phone switch signals. Some people were actually skilled enough that they could whistle. A lot of people that got into phone phreaking, well, a lot of people that were visually impaired, legally blind, if you will, got interested in this hobby. Some of them were so good at whistling, they could actually whistle the tones they needed. It's an interesting note in history that for a while, Captain Crunch was giving away these whistles as an inbox giveaway. I'll see if I got my finger on over the right middle hole here. All right, so hopefully everybody heard that. That's a 2600 hertz tone. You could use that to seize a trunk and then go about the process of making free phone calls. Blue boxes. I don't actually have a blue box. I'm trying to talk a friend into building me one, so hopefully he comes through for me at some point. But these generated a perfect 2600 hertz tone among a bunch of others. You'll notice that the blue buttons look an awful lot like the dial pad, including the the star and the hash key. But yeah, these were used for controlling phone switches, and again, this is what paved the way for phone phreaks to be able to make free phone calls. Beige boxes were simply a lineman's handset, or a homemade variety thereof. So I've got a few different ones here. This is a real deal AT&T standard issue equipment lineman's handset. And this is very durable. I could probably start whacking the podium. It's going to leave all sorts of bad dents in the podium. This handheld is probably going to be just fine. But this had, essentially all the numbers on the phone for test phone. We got, again, talked about touch tone and pulse switches. It has that on-off button, standard dialing things. You got lights to give you indicators, tell you if the line's live or not. They have these alligator clips on the end. So there's a couple things you could do with this. You could actually clip onto a phone block if you found one. These are very sharp. You could actually use it to pierce insulation on a phone cable, or wire rather, and actually make contact. You could literally listen in and eavesdrop on calls with other people being unsuspecting. And again, sort of a good dovetail based on the previous talk. Not exactly the same, but fairly similar. Now these were very expensive, kind of hard to come by. So what if you didn't have one? They were expensive to buy, and if you couldn't really afford one, I wouldn't endorse it, right? But maybe you go around the neighborhood and you see if there's a telephone van and figure out if the doors are locked or not and see what's inside. Again, I wouldn't endorse it, but I'm sure it's happened. Now, if that wasn't really possible, or your risk tolerance wasn't there, you could grab something like this. And this is really just a homemade variety. It's just a standard phone. What makes this a perfect beige box is all the controls, the switch hook, everything is on the handheld. So in other words, the cradle is just a hunk of plastic, and that's all it is. And so what you could do is lop off the end of the cable and solder on some alligator clips and make a homemade variety of a lineman's handset or a beige box. I got sort of curious, and I thought, well, I wonder, today, can you just order something that's a less expensive variety? And so sure enough, a certain online large retailer, for less than $20 delivered to your house, is a test phone, and it's really a beige box. Now what's cool about this is the cable they give you, they basically splice the alligator clips in line, but you also have the phone modular jack. So if you encountered a jack and you want to plug in and figure out if that jack is live or not, you could do that with this device. If you wanted to clip in or clip onto a wiring block, you could do that as well. And it's really simple and genius when I look at this and think, I remember carrying around like 2 cables and stuff like that. It's such a simple idea and so elegantly done to splice in the alligator clips. I think, why didn't I think of that? I kind of wish I had, because it's really brilliant. Another thing you could do if you wanted a more permanent connection is use one of these. This is a punch down tool. Now this particular one's got a reversible blade, so it'll do the older 66 block, it'll do the newer, if you will, the 110 block. You have to be careful when you use the 110 block because the blade is actually sharp on one end. It'll cut off the excess wire, and if you aren't careful and you don't cut off the excess wire, you'll accidentally cut the wire short and it'll fall off the block. You'll feel really stupid. I know this because it may have happened a time or two I don't really want to talk about it. But there are also blades in the bottom of this. It's got adjustable tensions and so forth. But basically, I would put the wire on the peg, push it down, and so you probably hear that punch going down. So this was a punch down tool, and again, very useful if you wanted to give yourself a more permanent connection or do some creative rewiring. Nowadays, when we talk about reconnaissance, we have that in mind where we're doing OSINT, we're maybe scanning some things, we're seeing what's in Shodan or a census or any variety of tools, right? Back in the day, there were a lot less security cameras, so you might go around the outside of a building. And if you were really brave, you might even see about sneaking into the building and seeing if you can find the telco closet where you could have your way and do a lot of fun and interesting things. But the idea behind the beige box is you could tap into a line, you could give yourself a phone extension, all sorts of stuff. Pay phones were once very commonplace. Now you rarely see them, but it provided a physical layer of separation from home. And what I mean by that is you could call a payphone, you could coordinate a call, and if you picked up on the payphone that somebody called, you had a little bit of plausible deniability. You could say, I was just at the convenience store getting something to drink or a bag of chips. Phone rang, I picked it up, and somebody was on the other end, so we just started talking. Conversely, if somebody called you from a payphone, again, you could deny that you knew who it was and say, I don't know, the phone rang, so I picked up and answered, and we just started talking. Now, I didn't try to squeeze an entire payphone inside my suitcase here, but what I did bring is a real deal payphone handset. And this is kind of cool because you have an armored exterior cable, and then you have a inner steel cable with a nice anchor here to keep people from tearing it off of the phone, although it still sometimes happened. Yeah, this was kind of a cool relic, and this is off of a real deal payphone. So, red boxing. Let's talk a little bit about red boxing. Red boxing was essentially used by phone phreaks to load fake money into payphones by playing tones into a handset's mouthpiece. Now, we didn't call these things replay attacks back in the day, but by gosh, that's exactly what they were. And this enabled users to place free phone calls, again, from telco-owned and operated payphones. And the way this worked is that you had tones, and so some people sort of modified electronic devices. Some people who had skill with hardware could build their own. So if you didn't have that, we'll talk about recording a little bit later, but you could also do other things like recording others, playing it back. Again, we didn't call them replay attacks, that's what they were. Let's see if I can get this to play here. So one thing I tell everybody is I am 21 till I die. I swear though, I actually rolled these tones myself really ancient times ago. So did everybody hear that okay? All right, heads nodding in the back. That's a good sign. So what's interesting is you had the dimes, you had the nickel tones. Canada also had their dimes, nickels, and quarters, but the tones were single tone. I've got those on here. I also have 10 pence and 50 pence piece off of a British pound. So different countries had different tones, different frequencies, that sort of thing. But red boxing was fairly universal. Now, in the early days, you could actually just play those tones right into the payphone mouthpiece and then go about making your call. A little bit later on, the phone company wised up, and we're going to talk about that as well, but they essentially had it to where until you had a completed call, it would not listen to anything coming into the mouthpiece. So then you had to start socially engineering operators. So you might call and ask for a phone number. They'll give you the number and tell them, oh shoot, my pencil just snapped, my pen ran out of ink, ugh, this keypad is way disgusting. Can you patch me through to that number? At which point they'll say, okay, just deposit 75 cents for the first 5 minutes, Again, you play your red box tones into the handset, go about making your phone calls. Tape recorders. So for those not adept at building electronic tone generators, circuits, using a tape recorder and playing it back was a perfectly viable alternative. So these were often combined with a phone recording device or adapter. And I've got a couple of varieties here. Maybe kind of hard to see in here, but this essentially has modular jacks. So this really goes in between any part of that phone, and you've got the cord. So basically this is like a network tap that we would have today, except for the phone system, and you have a audio cable line going out, so you could plug it into either a mic in or a line in jack, for example, and record tones that way. That's if you had access to modular jacks. As we saw at the payphone, you may not always have access to modular jacks. And again, with the rotary dial phone I had, you don't have access to modular jacks. So then you would have an adapter like this. And this is really just a suction cup. It's got an inductor coil inside of it. How this works is I just stick it on the back of the phone here. And what happens is the conversation or tones or whatever is happening produces vibration. It moves the inductor coil inside of here, goes to the line, audio line, again, to a mic in or a line in. You could record tones, you could record conversations, you could record really whatever you want, and this worked even if you didn't have modular jacks. Now, I'll be honest, the quality was not great, but the phone system had to have pretty good tolerances for not good connections. Audio connections tended to be bad. They could be impacted by weather, location. There were a lot of variety of reasons, but oftentimes you would hear static on the line, all sorts of other things. So this often worked pretty well in those situations. Scanners and radios, these were capable of listening into wireless communications and eavesdropping on conversations. You had an excellent example of that in the talk one right before this one, but where it got interesting is people would unwittingly bug themselves. So the early cordless phones operated in 43 to 50 megahertz range. Later on, those moved into 900 megahertz and beyond. And the early cell phones operated in the 800 megahertz band. Now I've got a couple SDRs with me as well. Not as cool gear as they had in the previous talk, but I've got a sort of a generation 1 New Elect software-defined radio. I didn't bring my big, bulky, heavy radios and scanners with me, but this wouldn't do the low end, but it would absolutely do the higher end stuff. And then I also have a little bit newer generation, not the latest thing, but RTL SDR version, hardware version 3. And so again, you could obviously listen in, eavesdrop on things. What's interesting is we talked about, or earlier was talked about, don't listen to phone calls. What happened actually is the FCC actually told manufacturers you can no longer sell scanners and radios operate in the 800 megahertz range that cell phones operated on to keep people from eavesdropping in on those conversations. So those were called cell blocked. So there are a couple things. If you had an 800 megahertz scanner radio that predated that, you were golden. You had something that was before the law went into effect. Now, Canada has the same frequencies, same steppings, that sort of stuff as we do, not the same laws. So some people might go on a camping trip to, say, Canada, grab a scanner or radio, and smuggle it across the border. Those things happened. And then also the early baby monitors operated on those lower frequencies, same things as the old cordless phones. People wouldn't stop to think. They would just have any conversation imaginable in earshot of a baby monitor, not realizing that anybody in the neighborhood with a scanner or radio that's sweeping through bands could find and listen in and eavesdrop on entire conversations, maybe even potentially illegal activities. But yeah, people just didn't stop to think about it, but absolutely happened. So PBXs, or private branch exchanges, these were phone switches operated by private businesses. Today we have MSPs, MSSPs, that sort of thing. It was once a big business to run phone service for an organization as a managed service. I'm sure it still happens, but probably to a much lesser extent. Even though these were smaller than what the telephone companies had, they did have some services like voicemail, they had extensions and some other things that you couldn't get through the phone company. So they absolutely added some features that people wouldn't normally have. And again, providing interconnected phone services within a business was definitely a desire for organizations. So like most technology, it lends itself well towards abuse, hacking, if you will. We didn't have LinkedIn back in the day, but what you could do is call into a business if they had an automated number and do a dial by name directory, and you could just go through that whole thing, almost like word dialing, where you just increment up the alphabet, start notating who works at a business, what extension they're at, and that came into play later because you could use it for social engineering, compromising voice mailboxes, and listening to saved messages. This was almost too easy most of the time because if somebody had like a 3-digit extension, guess what the PIN was for their voicemail? The same 3-digit extension, or 4 digits, or whatever it was, right? So it was very easy to compromise and just listen to other people's saved messages. In particular, after hours, you probably weren't too likely to get caught. If you thoroughly owned a PBX, though, you could actually set up your own voicemail box and really use that for social engineering. So if I have a voicemail extension on a phone system, I can start calling people in the business saying, hey, I need this information, or give me a call with this data. I need it for a report I'm working on. You don't answer, so that if they leave it in the voicemail, you can then go back later and retrieve that message. You can literally play phone tag and get all sorts of juicy information, and the other person doesn't really suspect anything because it's an internal phone extension. One of my own favorites is it transfers to extension 91. So if I call up the phone company and say, hi, this is Matt, I'm with the phone company. I am running a test. I need you to please transfer me to extension 91. Why 91? Because in most phone systems, 9 gets you an outside line. 1 is the first number for a long-distance phone call in the United States of America. You could substitute other country codes. And if they transfer me to that and I have a live line, I can then piggyback on, dial whatever number I want. It's not me who placed the phone call to the business that's going to get stuck with the bill. It's going to be the business itself. Now, the important thing to remember is that most phone companies build like an entire month in arrears. So we're in May right now. If this happened, you probably wouldn't even see the May phone bill until July. And by then, we talk about dwell time now. Well, there was serious dwell time back in the day. Call forwarding, diverters, and other routing tricks. So if I thoroughly own a PBX, I could call, dial an extension, have it forward to a long-distance phone number of my choosing. Again, I'm not paying the bill for it. It's the business that won't see it for probably a couple months, if they're paying attention at all to what their phone bill is. Diverters were essentially like if a business had an answering service, it would transfer people to after hours. A real person would pick up, take a message. If they hung up and you still had a dial tone, again, you could piggyback on that dial tone and dial out to whatever number you're choosing. So that was also another PBX hack, diverter hack, if you will, sort of in that same family. Phone phreak tradecraft, dumpster diving, or trashing. That's tried and true. I think probably everybody knows what that is. Call routing loops and 3-way calling used for eavesdropping and or pranks. We didn't call these things adversary in the middle, man in the middle, whatever term you like to use, but that's exactly what you could do with this stuff. You could set up a 3-way calling loop, listen in, and just listen, gain all sorts of information. You could also bide your time and wait till you decide you're going to interject your own voice onto the call, so people who think they're having a private 2-way conversation, boom, all of a sudden, wait, who is this person and how are they on our phone line? Social engineering phone operators and our telco employees. When I talked about dumpster diving, you can find passwords, pins, all sorts of juicy stuff. You could also find manuals. Well, why were manuals valuable? Manuals were valuable because you could learn how phone company employees talk. If you're going to call a phone company and say, I need to disconnect this number, I need to forward the call to another number, I need to change the type of service I have, I need to add these features, whatever it is, if I'm going to call phone companies and try to talk them into this, I better be able to talk like a telephone company employee to sound legitimate. So yeah, that's really quality social engineering. And then calling card fraud and abuse. Calling cards were, you had a card that you would call a toll-free number from anywhere. You would put in your number, you would put in a PIN, you would put in the number you want to call. It would bill it back to you, but people would swipe, trade these things often. People would raid mailboxes, stuff like that, get these calling cards. They could run up somebody else's phone bill rather than their own. So telco countermeasures, really it became cat and mouse with between phone companies and the phone phreaks. And so really they started clamping down on what you could get away with and what you could do. And so when they did that, phone phreaks would have to adjust their tactics. This still goes on today, right? As defenders, offensive security folks, we're always upping each other's games and skills, and we have to keep adjusting our tactics and those sort of things. Same thing with the phone system. And so, but eventually the phone phreak boxes, if they didn't basically get shut down, they kind of became obsolete because it became pointless to steal phone calls. But things have changed, so switchboard operator careers, there aren't too many of them. They were mostly displaced by technology in recent decades. Market saturation of mobile phones has really made deploying and maintaining payphones financially infeasible for telcos today. And then, payphones have just disappeared from the landscape as a result. Nowadays, the proliferation of unlimited and flat rate cellular plans eliminates the incentive to steal phone calls like we talked about. VoIP has changed things a lot. That's really most any deployment of a phone system now is usually some sort of VoIP technology. Calling card fraud, which we talked about, was once very prevalent. Now it's sort of given way, I would say, to credit card fraud is big business now. The new underground, phone phreak bridges, these conference call party lines and virtual meeting places have mostly gone away. So, they've different web conferencing platforms, encrypted communication mobile apps like Signal and Telegram, stuff like that. Dark nets, including the dark web. Things are different. So data dumps and dark marketplace use today is far more prevalent, I would say, than old school dumpster diving. Plus, there's a lot of cameras now. That didn't used to be the case. And then mobile malware, you could argue it's not really phone phreaking, but it is an attack surface vector that used to not exist, that absolutely exists now. And then we talked about payphones and use for anonymity, but back in the day, proxy servers, VPN services, and Tor mostly use the cloak communication source endpoint origins today. In other words, hide where your attack's coming from. And in the epilogue, technology and telephony abuse, far less of a technology hobbyist, enthusiast, and prankster activity now. It's really kind of given way to big business, advanced persistent threats, different threat actor groups. Hacktivists are very fond of doing things. Financially motivated actors, organized crime, and nation states. So we've gone from innocent hobbyists just playing around to serious stuff. Lest anybody think that all modern forms of phone phreaking are dead, reverse toll fraud is still a problem sometimes. So if I can hijack a web conference and do a callback to a high toll number, or similar, if I can get onto somebody's phone system, dial these pay per minute numbers, maybe I'm in cahoots with somebody overseas and we're splitting the profits, that still happens. In the early days of the pandemic, everybody here remembers Zoom bombing. That was a very prevalent thing. So eavesdropping, call bombing, raiding, hijacking attacks, it's still a modern threat. Vishing and smishing, again, attack surface used to not exist thanks to the proliferation of mobile phones. Porting or port out fraud is if I can convince one phone service provider to migrate a number to their service. If I go to a prepaid thing and say, hey, this is my number, the employee might have their standard run book where they would shoot me down, but how many times are they not paid real well? They've got bills to pay or things on their shopping wish list. Might be able to bribe that person for a certain dollar amount to make that port out fraud. Mobile SIM swapping may or may not be to a different service provider. It's really the same sort of principle. And again, social engineering or bribing phone company employees to make those changes. This is sort of an old school kind of talk. So I've got some shout outs. 2600 magazine, we talked about the significance of 2600 hertz and blue boxing and seizing trunks and that sort of stuff. This magazine has been in print since 1984. It's still in publication today, and it's now best known as the Hacker Quarterly, has been in a quarterly format for a long time. Phreaking, just when you think this thing is completely dead forever, once in a while, I think they even have a relatively new edition that was released not all that long ago. But every once in a while, there's still like a new edition that gets cranked out. But that goes back to 1985 and the old BBS days, bulletin board systems, where you'd use an acoustic coupler to dial into other computers listening purposely. In that case. But yeah, Phone Losers of America, they still do some funny stuff. They've got a YouTube channel, a lot of great old history stuff. They actually operate a phone phreaker bridge today. Now, if you call it to talk to other phone phreaks, I'm sure they'd love to talk to you. Just maybe be a little careful about what you talk about and the information you disclose, particularly to people you don't see face to face and you don't really know in person. Project MF is kind of cool. Now, in this case, MF stands for multi-frequency, not a couple other words I know that have that acronym. This is, if you're like, man, that blue boxing stuff, the old phone phreaking stuff, if only I could go back in time and do this stuff myself, that would be great. This is a cool project. They have a Windows software blue box you can get, download, and use. They have an asterisk stack that you can, spin up, and they also have hardware plans where you can make a blue box using an Arduino and modern technology, but they actually have some test number stuff you can use. You can go back and retro phone phreak like it was the olden days. It's all emulated and so forth, but cool project. Textfiles.com and Jason Scott, who runs that. A lot of old BBS stuff, bulletin board system stuff back in the 80s, 90s. Now, sometimes people would purposely put out bad information around phone phreaking. Sometimes people would unwittingly put out bad information about phone phreaking, not realizing it was bad information. But there's all kinds of fun stuff out there if you want to poke around and read that. Tina Kazeniak is a good friend of mine. What makes her so cool is she actually used to work in telco fraud. And so it's really cool to talk to her and kind of get that other side of the table perspective. We're good friends now. Once upon a time, maybe wouldn't have been the case. But just to hear her stories and how much they lived to bust the smart kids horsing around the phone system, doing stuff they weren't supposed to, and people legitimately trying to commit big time phone fraud, that sort of thing. Just an absolute blast to talk to her. I probably don't have a lot of time for questions, but if there's a couple, I might have time for them. Anybody have questions? Question over there? So the question is, do any of these old red box things work on a payphone if you can find them today? I'll be honest with you, I don't know. A lot of the newer payphones are what they call COCOTs, or customer-owned coin-operated telephones. Those were not red boxable. Those were private people would basically pay rent to put up a payphone and collect funds. You would have to find one still operated by the phone company. What's interesting is I have seen some rest stops that still have these. I'll be honest with you, I kind of like not being in prison, so I've never actually tried to red box them in modern times. It's a great question, though. Has anybody tried that they're willing to admit to? I don't see any hands going up, so either people haven't done it or they just don't want to fess up. Any other questions?
I have a question.
Yes.
So I grew up in Brazil and we had a different system, the pulse system as opposed to the tone system. How did that differ in other places?
So the question is on pulse and tone. To be honest with you, it really just kind of depended where you lived geographically and what the phone service operated. So for example, in Knoxville, Tennessee, they probably had very different demands than, in this country than say rural Montana, for example. So I can't really speak a whole lot to international stuff other than some Canada stuff that was similar to the United States, but different in some areas. I wish I had a better answer for you about a lot of the other foreign countries, but I have talked, and what other people have told me is they had their own little tricks and their own little pranks that they like to do in other countries. I talked to somebody from Greece, and she was telling me about some of the stuff that they would play around with, and it was good fun. I have never even left this country, so I would love to have a better answer for you. I honestly just don't know. Anybody else? All right, well, let me leave with this parting thought. If you want to get good at information security, hopefully you understand now where a lot of this stuff comes from. But if you really want to get good information security, learn to think like an attacker. And I don't see enough black hats out into that crowd, so we're going to go ahead and fix this problem right now. This is actually harder than it looks. Whoop, that was terrible. All right, last one, here we go. Whoop, sorry. I'm not the best at this, but yeah, it's been awesome. Thank you, besides Knoxville!